welcome to RUSI, everybody, and welcome, Emily. I think if we need any reminder of the surprises that British politics keeps throwing up, then we need look no further than the last weekend. Quite remarkable turns of events, and I'm sure there will be more such turns over the weeks to come as we approach the referendum which the Prime Minister has called for July. The purpose of RUSI is not, of course, to take sides in party political debates, but it is one of our important functions is to provide a platform for politicians of every stripe, from every party, to express their views on the issues which we hold dear and which we focus on in relation to defence and security policy. And that's why it's my great pleasure to introduce Emily Thornberry, a distinguished Member of Parliament, recently become the Shadow Secretary of State for Defence and charged with the issue of leading the Labour Party's review of defence policy, about which she will talk shortly. And I think it's an indication of the interest in your talk that we have such a distinguished audience before us. I can recognise quite a number of people from the media, from officials in government at present, and indeed those who have served in government in the past. So, Emily, without further ado, I'm looking forward very much to what you have to say.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Malcolm. And can I start by saying what a privilege it is for me to speak here today, and in such a gorgeous room, and in front of such a distinguished audience. I'm going to start by quoting a line from the Tory manifesto in 2015, and also a line from the Labour manifesto, and see if you can guess which is which. The first duty of government is to keep you safe, says one. The primary duty of any government is the defence of the nation and its interests, says the other. For once, it's a good thing that there's hardly any difference between the Labour and the Conservative manifestos, because it means that no matter what party's in government, that commitment to the primacy of defending the nation will never be in any doubt. But what strikes me, though, in this my second month as Shadow Secretary of State for Defence, is that the moment we start to get into any detail on this, the debate on defence becomes much more complex and frankly more contentious. For most of the last century, we knew exactly what kinds of threats we were facing, and importantly, we had a pretty good idea of what we needed to do to deter them. And the same cannot be said today. Risks have been evolving in recent years, some with the most unimaginable speed. And at the same time, new threats have emerged, often with little or no warning. Despite the best of intentions, successive governments have not always been quick enough to adapt to this changing environment. Now, as most of you probably know, I've been asked by Jeremy Corbyn to lead a review into Labour's defence and security policy. A review, by definition, is something that looks back on events and how we have responded to them. But an important part of my work is to draw conclusions based on the evidence about what we have done in confronting security threats over the years, but also what we could have done better. Of course, even more important than learning lessons is how we use them to apply them to an uncertain future. And so in my review, I want to do more than simply looking backwards. I also want to look forwards too. And I want to try and stimulate a debate. And I believe that this is very important. My challenge is to build a consensus around a new strategy for keeping Britain safe in the 21st century, maintaining our global role and adapting to the rapidly changing environment. It has been said that Whitehall doesn't do strategy, and it isn't hard to see why. But if we accept that there is no responsibility more important than defence, we also have to accept that we must not shy away from that challenge. In considering the concept of strategy more fully, I want to say a few words about this blue book that has been on my bedside table and has made my nighttime reading recently. Its full official title is National Security Strategy and Strategic Defence and Security Review 2015. I have to say that it seems to me a singularly inappropriate title for a document that, much like its predecessor from 2010, isn't really strategic at all. The Commons Defence Committee has defined strategy as, quote, a course of action integrating ends, ways and means to meet policy objectives. That seems a pretty good definition. My quarrel with the current administration is less in terms of its ability to identify the sort of objectives, but more, which is kind of the easy bit, but what I'm less impressed by is their ability to identify and deploy the ways and means that those objectives are going to be achievable. The SDSR that was published in 2010, when the coalition was first elected, is a case in point. This famously was the so-called strategy that gave us aircraft carriers without any aircraft, and then left us with no aircraft carriers at all. This was the strategy which scrapped the Nimrod MRA-4 program, leaving us unable to patrol our own waters. This was the strategy that cut the Navy's surface fleet by a sixth, and this was the strategy that cut the size of the army by a fifth, and pretended that all this could be done without any so-called shrinkage of our influence on the international stage. This was a spectacularly optimistic assumption, in my view, which turned out to be just as spectacularly wrong. The International Institute for Strategic Studies estimates that when taken together, the cuts announced in 2010 meant a reduction of between 20 and 30% in our military capabilities. And with 5 years hindsight, those estimates don't look too far off. Our army is now the smallest that it has been since the Napoleonic Wars. Its size has been cut by a fifth since 2010, and this has been done, as we know, for purely financial reasons and without proper considerations of its implications. And at a time when we have been cutting our own army so drastically, not everyone else has been doing the same. Russia, for example, is now capable of deploying 150,000 troops within 72 hours. Based on current planning, a NATO force of an equivalent size could take up to 6 months to assemble. And most importantly for us, only a fraction of it would be British. Compare that to the situation 32 years ago, when Britain sent almost 58,000 troops to take part in a single NATO exercise, an exercise called Lionheart. And last year, when a major exercise was held in Poland, we managed to send just 800 troops. 800. And it isn't just that the army that's been dealing with the consequences of the 2010 SDSR. The Royal Navy is now relying on a fleet of destroyers, which are liable to break down in the middle of operations because of a sudden power cut. And the RAF campaign in Syria and Iraq is dependent on aircraft that are 40 years old. Few people would think that was the best idea of a platform in 2016. Without the maritime patrol capability that we lost when Nimrod was cut up and sold for scrap, we have had to leave it to the Canadians and the Americans to track Russian submarines when they're seen off the coast of Scotland. And we are still as much as 10 years away from having full carrier strike capability. It's no wonder, then, that a senior military figure quoted in the press at the time described the 2010 review as a fig leaf with the word strategy written on it. Many were expecting the 2015 review to be just as bad, and were relieved when it turned out not to be. And I think Malcolm described last year's SDSR as a steady-as-she-goes review. But to say that it wasn't as bad as it could have been isn't really saying very much, is it? Because the truth is that we are still recovering from the damage done in the last 5 years. Some of it may be repaired in the next 5 years, but by no means not all of it. And some of the capabilities we have lost may never be recovered. But beyond its failure to properly clear up the mess, what I think may have been the most fundamental flaw in the last 5 years review was its failure to address the underlying problem, the absence of a genuine strategy to underpin the whole approach. As I've said, a strategy should start by looking at the threats before moving on to capabilities needed to respond to them. There was one threat in particular that has done more, perhaps than any other, to challenge the way in which we think about defence and security in recent years. When I was first elected an MP in 2005, within months, I had lost 13 people from Islington in a terrorist attack on 7/7. The attacks came as a brutal shock, not just to the families and the communities directly affected, to my local community, but to the entire country. Back then, we were still getting to grips with the new threat, which was radically different from that which we had faced before. In the 20th century, we usually thought of threats in terms of hostile governments and foreign countries. In the 21st, we are more likely to be kept awake by the possibility of seemingly random attacks by small groups or individuals acting on their own initiative and not under the direction of any state or authority, or even any recognizable group such as the IRA, which at least had a clear structure and a political agenda. Unlike traditional state-based threats, terrorism may be largely invisible until it's too late. This new form of terrorism does not respect international borders, it is harder to predict, and it is harder to trace once an attack has occurred. But although our understanding of the changing environment has improved, we are not yet able to stop the new terrorist threat itself from growing. So one thing we clearly need to get better at is tackling the root causes of violent extremism instead of just dealing with its consequences. As the rise of Daesh has reminded us, we can no longer think of the collapse of governments or armed conflict in failed or failing states as purely someone else's problem. In his foreword to the then Labour government's 1998 Strategic Defence Review, George Robertson, who was Secretary of State at the time, wrote that in the post-Cold War world, we must be prepared to go to the crisis rather than have the crisis come to us. Now today, it might be added that it is also in our national interest to do a better job of stopping so many international crises from breaking out in the first place. We know that poor governance and armed conflict are by far the most significant drivers of radicalisation, which may not only be based on distortions of religion, but also on social and economic factors as well. And we also know from past experience that tracking these drivers is extraordinarily complex. When the roots of the problem are political, we should look for political solutions and not just military ones. And when we do consider military action, we need to make sure that we have properly thought through the consequences, especially when there is a potential ripple effect which may cause further destabilization. For example, in Southeast Asia in the 1960s and in sub-Saharan Africa in the 1990s, we saw how conflicts that began in individual countries like Vietnam and Rwanda could rapidly spill over into surrounding regions. And today we're seeing the dynamic in the Middle East and in North Africa, whether it's the knock-on effects of conflict in Libya and Chad and Niger, or the spread of violence from Syria and Iraq to Yemen and Lebanon. In both cases, we see the resulting ungoverned space ruthlessly exploited by Daesh. Of course, forecasting all the possible consequences of military intervention is much easier said than done. But as the world continues to grow smaller, we should not allow ourselves to duck the questions which don't have easy answers. At the same time, as we re-evaluate the nature of threats that we face, we have also got to start recognizing the ways in which new and emerging technologies are changing the nature of conflict itself. We've just marked the 5th year anniversary of the Arab Spring. The protests that we witnessed in 2011 were profoundly influenced by the use of social media platforms, which we'd barely heard about 5 years before. And now, with the rise of Daesh, we are grappling with the threat of a murderous terrorist movement which has been brutally effective in its use of these platforms as a tool of boosting recruitment and spreading its vile propaganda. Or consider cyber attacks, a phrase which didn't even exist in the early 1990s. By 2015, as the Financial Times recently reported, the Ministry of Defence itself was fending off hundreds, if not thousands, of attempted cyber attacks every single day. And probably the most significant turning point of the interim years came in 2007. That year in Estonia, we witnessed what was probably the first ever instance of an attack launched by one state against another, entirely done in cyberspace. And since then, we have seen cyber operations conducted by states and non-state groups across a vast spectrum, from state-sponsored espionage to crude propaganda wars. And in some cases, like the alleged theft of the new F-35 aircraft designs, the implications for our conventional defences are enormous. But the threat is to civilian life as well, and could involve disruption to services as essential as electricity or water in the event of an attack on our critical national infrastructure. These are developments which fundamentally challenge traditional definitions of conflict, as well as the associated rules and norms of conduct. Our answer to the question is whether or not we are adequately prepared to respond to these challenges. This is a crucial test for our defence policies in the 21st century. I've said quite a lot about what I would refer to as new threats, but at the same time it's important to acknowledge that some of the old threats haven't necessarily gone away. Far from it. We can't simply dismiss the threat of hostility from foreign governments as a rhetoric of the 20th century. I'm reminded of this on a regular basis as I ask people as part of my review about the issues that concern them. And what comes up, perhaps more than any other topic, is Russia. And partly the perception is based on recent experience. Events in Georgia and the Crimea have shown Putin's interest in expanding Russia's sphere of influence and his willingness to use military force in order to do so. And beyond that, the fear that Russia often provokes can also be seen as an understandable reaction to words and images that in most cases had not until recently been seen or heard of since the Cold War. Russian rhetoric is increasingly strident and cannot simply be dismissed as grandstanding for domestic audiences. And the images we see, whether of Russian jets flying off the coast of Cornwall or of submarines in the North Sea, can be deeply unsettling. And against this background, it is perhaps understandable that some would not even contemplate a rethink of Britain's current strategy on nuclear weapons. But it is incumbent on all of us, I think, to try to look at this issue from a pragmatic point of view rather than an ideological one. We must ask ourselves whether the cost of 4 new submarines, which is more than an entire year's defence budget, will prove sufficient value for money in the long term, especially if it comes at the expense of other crucial investments in our defences. Moreover, we also need to consider the scope of the technological advances we are likely to see in the next 20 to 30 years, and we must ask whether, if we are going to commit ourselves to the current platform for the next 3 decades, whether it can really be seen as future-proof. These are the kinds of questions my defence review is going to be considering. So when I talk to people who tell me that they're worried about Russia, I can completely understand where they're coming from. But I also believe that we need to ask ourselves whether it is right to place our trust in one single weapons system to deter all threats and to protect us in all circumstances, and if we do, whether the platform we currently have is necessarily the right one. These kinds of debates about capabilities do usually revolve around platforms or the latest bit of kit. But as I come to the end of my remarks, I want to move the discussion further towards thinking more about what we can do with our people. The renowned military historian, Sir Michael Howard, recently said, "There are 3 things we are going to need for future wars: geeks, spooks, and thugs. The backroom computer geeks capable of dealing with cyber war, spooks to provide intelligence, which is vital, and thugs, special forces, small numbers of very able, very ruthless, sophisticated soldiers prepared to go everywhere." Now, while his description of special forces thugs isn't one that I'd use, the overarching point is well taken. So while maintaining the conventional forces at our disposal and ensuring that they are properly resourced, we also need to focus more on those vital specialisms, cyber experts, intelligence operatives, and special forces in the years to come. We are increasingly looking towards the ideal of multi-purpose force, civilian and military, which is capable of doing many things in many places at almost all times. Adaptability seems in many ways to be the holy grail of current thinking on defence and security policy. But adaptability, I think, has to mean adaptable people above all. Not to return to the language of party manifestos, but if we believe, as I'm quite sure everybody in this room does, that the most important duty of any government is to defend the nation and its people, then it follows that the most important debate that we can have as a country is how we can best go about doing that, now and in decades to come. This is undoubtedly a debate where we need the benefit of your expertise and ideas. You will recall that when the government originally launched a consultation on its so-called Strategic Defence and Security Review, submissions were limited to 200 words. Can I assure you that there is no word limit when it comes to receiving your input to Labour's Defence Review? And even if we only have limited time for questions and comments today, I'm looking forward to speaking to as many of you as possible in more depth over the next weeks and months. Thank you for your time today, and let's make sure the debate begins.